Afternoon, everybody. I realize that I stand between you and lunch, so I'll make sure I stick to time. It looks like you're getting a double dose of Novo Nordisk. I also, too, work at Novo Nordisk. I work in the International Operations office in Zurich, and I focus on market access. I noticed throughout the last day and a half, it's been a lot about HCPs, there's been a bit about medical, we've had some about supply. I'm now going to take a market access stance. So just as a background, I've been in market access, strategic account management for the last 10 or so years. I've also dabbled in a couple of years around CRM systems and how that can help the function. But today, I want to focus about how we're going to move away from payer engagement to payer value. And that has two elements to it. What does that look like with our payer customers? And what does that look like internally and how we measure that? All of it's a drive to see how do we get better patient outcomes and successes. So it's about the what, why, and how. These are the four areas I want to talk about. As we know, throughout all the health systems of the world, forever evolving. The political landscape's changing, budgets are getting tighter, or there's more people in the world, so there's more people to treat. And how are we going to then manage that engagement in that system? Secondly, one thing that hasn't been done a lot in access is segmenting customers. Why is that important? How does that help our engagement? How does that help us in an omnichannel world and the value of that? And if we do all those things right and understand them, then we really have to understand why is value important. Value is a buzzword, but it means many things to different people. But we also want to take it this a step further and say, what does value mean to us? And hopefully share with you something that looking to develop that will help answer that question. And lastly, something just for us to consider before we leave today about, as the world is changing, what else do we need to consider? So, because we're at the CX conference, and before I continue, so thank you, Dario, for the opportunity to present. These are my views, shaped in my time in the industry and the different markets I've worked in. I thought, let's go to ChatGPT and see what it says about payer engagement value. Thankfully, it came across very positive, but I wanted to point out two things. Is the sentence that it says, by working together, providing payers and stakeholders quality to make more affordable, enhanced patient outcomes. That is so, so important. And that is exactly what we're trying to do, or we say we're trying to do our best to provide that. But we have all the bits on the left of the bits we're working in. So for me, when I typed in, I was really nervous thinking, what will it come out with? And I'm glad that it came out with this, because this is exactly what the world we're working in. That said, what we also need to understand is the environment we work in. It's split into two sections here. You've got the traditional, the old school, 90s, early 2000 pharma, talking about value. Market access in general has been very much a binary function. If you were to ask 10, 15 people within any organization, and I've done that within my own and other companies I've worked for, what does market access do? You probably get about 20 different answers, right? From being a sales rep to a politician. It's that broad. The reality is, it's quite an evolving function, and I don't think people have got it particularly clear yet. One traditional thing is, have we or have we not got listings of a product? And market access does more than that. There's pre-launch, there's launch, and there's post-launch. However, as we know, things are changing. It's no longer enough to say that we've got a great drug with great clinical trial data, because most markets will then say to you, well, that isn't reflective of our population, and we have health economic problems. So how do you then translate that? So providing access to medicines is no longer as simple as saying, look at our data, you must use it with the right price. There's a lot of other things that we need to consider. Secondly, technology's advancing at such a quick rate. What we talk about today is probably already out of date. So we have to keep that in mind, and how do we stay 5 steps ahead of the technology? Going back to the fact that in access, we have to have a much broader overview. It's not about a launch of 2 years. It's 2 years before and 2 years after. How do we manage that? And how do we hit the sweet spot? So it's not just about saying we have a product available, we've got government legislation, we have the price, it's available. How are we engaging with our payers? And we have to remember, payers are not just government officials or chief pharmacists or prescribing advisors. They could also be finance directors, right? They could be clinical leads, they could be HCPs. It's a broad spectrum of people that we've clung together in the payer world. However, we have to get the price right. And for me, the last bit is the most important. We have to shift from product access to patient access. So it's then again, looking at different commercial models, how do we then engage with our payers in a different way? So when we talk about payer engagement, it's a multitude of things rather than it's just about, going back to the slide my colleague showed previously about the different ways we can engage. We have to consider as well the different types of commercial models we can then engage with. How do we then get access and sort of contribute to that level? So once we get to the stage of talking to our customers, we have to also understand we need the right balance between partnership and commercial. And what I've done here is just thrown in a couple examples. And this is really, really key because you have to wear one of two hats. You can't wear both. So if we're looking at patient outcomes, sometimes it is about the partnership. How do we then improve pathways? How do we then unblock the pain points to make sure patients can get access to the medicines? If it's the commercial bit, it's a typical conversation we always have. How do we get more of our product available to the patients? And internally, that's to help drive our SVT or our market share. And when we talk about market share later on, the important thing about market share is not necessarily the number, it's the quality of market share. That's something we'll talk about later. So this is all to give you the backdrop of what market access currently looks like in terms of engagement. Now the thing is, now we know that the environment we're working in, the question is, how do we then approach our customers? Having worked in several pharma companies, what's really clear is that market access doesn't really have segmentation. In the commercial world, what I mean by sales, you traditionally have A, B, C, and D. You have an adoption ladder, and the whole goal is to try to see your key targets, your KOLs, and move people along an adoption ladder. In access, we don't do that. Our payer engagement is either to reach a decision or to help shape health economies. And to do that, we have to segment differently. Our goal isn't to move people on an adoption ladder, it's to understand their spheres of influence and how they network internally so we can then therefore understand who they are and tailor messages to them. So I show this slide here, and this is looking at HCOs. Most of the conversations I've heard in the last day and a half has been around HCPs. What we need to do is look at how we target HCOs. This is bread and butter, I know, to most of you. It's a matrix. We're looking at people in the top right-hand corner. But the thing I'd like to draw your attention to is on the right-hand side. More often than not, we tend to look at the willingness to engage greater than we do the opportunity. Even though we say, let's look at the numbers, the reality is if we break it down to a granular level, to a sales rep or to someone in the field, they'll say, well, look at the people I need to see. Right? Who can I see layered into the areas I want to work? But what we're saying is, let's look at the opportunity. Going back to the landscape we work in, the health environment, the people, etc., that's something is a different shift. And we're looking at an organizational level because at Access, our territories, if you would like to call it, are much greater and larger in the sense of geographically. So we deal with networks, we deal with governments, we deal with larger territories. And this is what we've come up with, right? When we did some research and said, because we're not interested in the traditional segmentation, as we've said before, it's called influence and investment segmentation. And this is where it's different. So we look at the health system as it is, and we've put some titles on it. And then these are translatable in any market archetype you have. And what we're trying to understand is who's influential. So more often than not, human nature in any sales environment, you're governed by titles, right? Is someone a chief this? Is someone a principal that? Is someone a CEO, etc.? We're not bothered about that. So there's two elements to this. If we understand there's the influence relationship within a health system, from both a health system perspective, but from an internal, say, project management perspective, that helps us on many levels. One, that helps us understand how we can then drive decisions to make better outcomes for patients, etc. But also, how can we then tailor our messages to then influence people that we can't see? So this is not about who we can and can't see. This is about who's influential and how we can influence them. And it's more going back to one of, I think, our medical colleague yesterday, that then internalizes us to say, who else or who is the right person to see that individual? Or what is the right channel and what is the right content? So it's a very different way of looking at it. But it's not just enough to know the influence level across the health system. What we need to understand is, what does that connectedness look like? And this is just phase one. So phase one is, we can go very sophisticated and get into details of it. But because this is new for Access, simple, high, medium, and low. And again, this will translate differently across different markets, but it's the start of the conversation. It's not so rigid as other segmentation, but it's a start. but allows us to really understand the differences between the connectedness. Because ultimately, I compare this to, say, US politics and lobbying, right? You have a lot of people who are trying to get decisions made, and they see a lot of different people and try to sway decisions. It's a similar concept, but you need to understand the connectedness in this. So once we've done all this, we know the background we're working in, we've identified the individual's influence levels and what that then means. How do we then say, okay, well, how do we translate this to value? And I put this together and said, okay, what are the key things here for value? And I mentioned before about all of this is to drive patient outcomes. And from a commercial perspective, internally from an organization, we want to drive increased market share. But it's the quality of market share. That's so, so important. And if we understand the levels of influence, we're able to tailor the messages and have a better depth of engagement and satisfaction scores with those individuals. Thirdly, we're able to increase the quality and scope of our engagement. So we're now not limiting it to 100 customers. We're now saying who are the key customers that will drive actions, right? And that's a whole different way of looking at it than we currently do. And the last thing is about how do we provide a connected experience? So we need to work with our medical, we need to work with our marketing team, our omnichannel team, et cetera, to make sure that we're managing this ecosystem together. So that's what payer value looks like. Now, if we have to measure that internally, going back to the point of customer engagement is important because we want to build a relationship and trust and drive patient outcomes. But internally, we work for a commercial organization, so we have to make sure that we reach our targets as well. So these are things that we need to look at, and they have different reasons for it. Together is what we call a stakeholder engagement index. So if we're looking at the depth and breadth of engagement across health systems, looking at the investment and influence segmentation, we need to understand how much of that area we're seeing. We need to understand different levels of customers. How often are we seeing them, or are we seeing them at all? And how are they all connected? And are we getting depth and breadth of conversation? The one thing I need to point out here is we're not bound by frequency or call plan compliance. So none of this is bound by saying we need to see these people 2 or 3 times a day because we know that if we see them 3.4 times a cycle, that means messages will stick. We're going away from that and saying we're trying to drive quality of market share, quality of engagement, and by understanding the depth and breadth of connectedness and influence, we're able to see them and have meaningful conversations. It could be once, it could be twice, it could be 0, it could be through multi-channel. But the point is, it's all of this together helps us provide a stakeholder engagement index, which is, for me personally, from an access, is a deeper understanding of customer engagement versus saying we've seen 95% of our A's, 80% of our B's, and we've moved 30% up an adoption ladder. For me, so what? And I'll explain why I say so what to that, and I'm sure people will not be happy with it. So that's, for me, is how we translate that internally to say what does engagement look like? Now this is something I'm really excited about. It's something new. If I were to ask anybody in the audience and say, okay, if your company made $100 million in profit, right? How was that achieved? Most people from, say, commercial excellence would say, do you know what? It's because we've had so many people in the field, so many engagements, so many customers seen, so many people moved up an adoption ladder, and it's universally accepted. Throw in Net Promoter Score and throw in other metrics you want to, and most of it they'll say is that's because people in the field have seen people and engaged in conversations, placed products patients have got seen and treated. The question is, what about the other functions? We can't include medical because it's too close to the line to commercial to say what they do, but what about the work that we do in access? So what we're developing at the moment is, and it's been a passion of mine for the last 4 or 5 years, is how can we turn around and say, out of that 100 million, what about the work that access has done? How has that contributed to that 100 million? Or reversing and saying, if we didn't do that work, how much of that 100 million would have been realized? And so, I suppose 2 questions here. What has that got to do with payer engagement and value? And 2 is, and what? For me, if we do all the other bits right, connect with our customers to influence, we'll be able to demonstrate the work we do. However, if we look at the work that we do in access, it's project-based, it's not, what's the word I'm looking for? Interaction-based. So we deliver outcomes over a period of time. It could be in line with a sales cycle or outside a sales cycle. So 3 examples: have we or not got a product listed? Have we completed a project? And the third one is, have we implemented a commercial agreement? All of this are able for us, if we get this right, And I'm going to run a model at some point to say, yeah, that makes sense. So we can therefore have an equal footing with the other parts of the organization, or at least have a voice in other parts of the organization to say the engagements that we are doing with our customers and the project work that we are doing to help unlock a potential for patients to receive medicines have an intrinsic value to the organization. And 9 times out of 10, access is probably the smallest function within an organization, probably that in medical. But it's a gray area as well in some markets because in the Far East, they're key account managers. In the US, they're innovation directors. There's different titles altogether. But that's how we can measure that internally. So I've got a few minutes left, but just to summarize, there's a real opportunity here from an engagement perspective, how we can then sort of move this to a larger scale. And what I would like to say is we really need to include marketeers. I've worked for 3 or 4 organizations, and what I haven't seen is true market access marketeers because it's blended between public affairs. And then you have some of them who sit in brands who don't do market access. And then you have someone who say, well, we just get an agency to do it. Pure market access marketeers. I've seen one market in one company, and it was in the UK where they had market access marketeers who did promotional and non-promotional marketing in line with brands. And it's really interesting because to have the promotional, non-promotional conversation, we don't need a core story. We don't need the key messages per se. It's looking at how do we tailor that to our payer customers. So it's not the one size fits all. So for me, that's the future. And with that, we need to have the multi-channel. But to do the multi-channel, we need to understand our segmentation and our influences, et cetera, et cetera. So if I were to summarize, the world is changing, budgets are becoming tighter, access is having a more important role. I personally believe that the term access is incorrect. We're strategic account managers, right? If you say access, you get niched into, say, pricing and reimbursement, but we're strategic account managers managing health economies to improve access. And we work in partnership with medical, marketing, sales. And together, through CRM systems, through digital channels, et cetera, we can improve our payer engagement, ultimately leading to greater access to our medicines and patient outcomes, as well as commercial returns to an organization. And that's it. That's it for me. Any questions? It's okay.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. A bit of an out-of-the-box question, and perhaps building on what you said last, that we shouldn't actually call these access field folks access, but key account managers. So I actually started my career working in B2B sales / account management, and I had the title key account management. And it was very normal that, we didn't have separate access people. So you had at some point procurement as your counterparts, right? You needed to get on the rooster of a company, agency rooster. Then you had, of course, so I was selling marketing solutions. So you had the marketeers as your counterparts. So you had these different counterparts, and you knew how to handle with them differently at different stages of the process. So what's your thinking regarding actually unifying the functions more?
It's an interesting question. So the reality is that when I started in pharma 20 odd years ago, you start off as a sales rep or a healthcare manager. The reality is, even in B2B, I think when I started in sales, I was at Coca-Cola, right? No one's a sales rep now, right? The titles are so broad and generic, you could probably be a CEO, right? The reality is no one's a sales rep. For me, it doesn't matter what the title is, it's the ways of working. So it's just, for me, to your point, you can merge all the jobs together. And there's some companies where they're merging even MSLs into strategic account management, where they're doing all 3 roles, right? In line with compliance, which is a bit tricky. But for me, it's a case of how do we want to manage health? How do we want to manage territories? And for me, a territory is a health system. It's not, and this is the change I think we need to start looking at, is it's not just saying you have 110 customers, which therefore means you need a full-time equivalent, so therefore let's have a sales rep. We're trying to grow the business by 5%. As an example, how are we going to grow the business? Who is in the right place to understand the infrastructure of that area to really identify the opportunities and bringing the right people in? And if I make a generic statement, it's not one function. It's probably more access than it is sales. And the reason I say that is, look at how we segment and how we achieve our targets. Sales are very much focused on call plan compliance, frequency, numbers, etc. and they're the doers, in a very general comment, right? Where access, totally agree. And access is, again, maybe a bit too niche, looking at a bit too high level. So you need a bit of both, is the point. But I would say it's more, the sales reps couldn't do the access jobs can't do the sales job, right? In reality. So you need there's only a handful of people. And there was a company 6 years ago that tried it. They put an advert this is the UK example. They put an advert in the UK saying they were paying ridiculous salaries and saying we want people to manage this area. You're responsible for your P&L, your secretary, your advertising, etc. And it was a massive departure from the normal. Load of the people applied, and it was for 4 people to cover the whole of the UK. And that company the company's still around, but that role only lasted 6 months because the people they hired couldn't do that level of role. But it was a mixture between access, account management, and sales. So my point is, yes, they should merge the roles. What that role looks like is yet to be decided. And the people who could do that are not very many, in my opinion, only because it's too much of a hybrid. And I think people are used to the niches. Am I more government and public affairs? Am I more of an operational and sales? And when you want to do the bit together, that's hard. And the last thing on that is, if you find those people, it's having the salaries to pay those individuals. You get what you pay for. And because if you want those individuals, the salaries would be necessarily quite high. If you look in the US, the salaries for those individuals are quite high, whereas in the European markets, they're not or don't exist. I hope that's answered your question. I think that's it. Perfect. I think that's it now. So I'll hand you guys back to Dario. Thank you.